Hey everybody, I'm Luke Monaghan, as just said. I'm from a big media creative performance agency called Fetch. I know when you say Fetch, you think of Mean Girls Fetch, we get that a lot. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about mobile performance, so in particular the importance of site speed. A lot of us know the importance of site speed, but in terms of the mobile perspective, mobile versus desktop as we see it today, what we can do to optimize the mobile performance and the future of mobile moving forwards. So, as we know, site speed is important. As I said, it's not news to us. It's important from a crawling perspective, and it's also important for users. What I'm going to be focused on in this talk mainly is about the user perspective. But when it comes to crawlers, it's a ranking factor. So for desktop, it was as of 2010, and then for most recently, mobile, 2018. It's an expectation from the user as well. So this is probably a stat that everyone's been aware of. But 53% of users abandon a mobile site if it takes longer than 3 seconds. So this is something that you want to keep in your head throughout this presentation. So what's important is that it's an expectation from a user perspective with a real-world impact. So some of you may have seen this, but with the BBC, they calculated for every second that it takes for their site to load, 10% of their users will have gone, which, if you think about the amount of people that visit their site, is huge. From a monetary perspective, Amazon calculated that for a 1-second page slowdown throughout 1 year, it could cost their business $1.6 billion. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's a huge impact it can have. So all this considered, is anyone here from Made? Good. So I ran this test on Made just to see, this is using a Nexus 5 average 3G connection based in a London IP. As you can see how slowly this is taken. As a user, I would have left by now. But essentially, this takes around about 29 seconds to fully load. So if we were to break this out with Google's user-centric metrics, which is more of a user-focused approach to site speed as opposed to these vanity metrics, like 100 out of 100. So from a user stance, first contentful paint, which is where the first bit of content is really shown, so it could be the navigation or the logo above the fold. Is it happening? It's taking them almost 6 seconds to see the page doing something. Is it useful? So first meaningful paint, where we're talking about the image above the fold, or if it's the header above the fold, it takes 10 seconds. And then is it usable? So time to interactive, 22 seconds before you can start using this page. So why are we seeing this, especially when we're here? So this is in terms of device for the UK. We're around about even when it comes to device usage between desktop and mobile. Obviously, search isn't the only way people are going to visit your site, so having this in terms of perspective is important to know. But we are not truly mobile first. I know mobile first probably going to be said a lot today, but in particular with site speed. So we probably all recognize this lovely lighthouse output, but in particular the focus here is the disparity that we see between desktop and mobile. Obviously, there are variables at play here, so CPU when it comes to mobile, network connection. But that being said, this shouldn't be an excuse for the disparity. So what can we do to meet the mobile site speed expectation? So this is a good quote from Google in terms of how you should put your perspective when it comes to monitoring how your site is performing. So they say that multiple moments during the load experience that can affect whether a user perceives it as fast or slow. And one of the main focuses throughout this is the perceiving, the perception. And Jono, in a recent talk, link is down here, watch it later, I highly recommend it, recently talked about how the perception of speed is actually what's most important. If you think from a user perspective, from a conversion perspective, that perception that a page is loading fast is ultimately what's going to really drive your revenue. So in context, although it's really nice to get 100 out of 100 in Lighthouse, especially from a client perspective, or a grade A in Pingdom, it's not really about that. It's about making your site feel fast for the user. So here, another study by Google, they say that they've calculated that it takes around about a second for a user to realize that something is slow. So putting that into context, ultimately our main aim here with the perception is to make sure that our site loads in under 1 second, which is a hard ask, but when we're talking about the perception and how we can prioritize that content, there are a lot of ways that you can achieve this. As I say, deliver the perception of speed. So in terms of how this could look, I mean, this isn't where we want to be, but it's definitely going in the right direction. As you can see here, Airbnb, it was perceived load of 4 seconds. It looked like the site loaded in 4 seconds. In actuality, for it to fully load, it was 9 seconds. So the user thinks that site is fast, it's more likely to stick around, reduce that bounce rate. And one thing to also focus on, which I will touch upon later, is the first thing that loaded. So it's their search function. They know what's important for the user when they first come to the site, so that's what they prioritize when it comes to loading the site. Another study by Google, when reviewing 900,000 mobile landing pages, analysed that 70% took more than 5 seconds to display visual content above the fold. So this is anything above here, which, again, from a user perspective, is mostly what matters to you and when it comes down to that perception. So how do you achieve the perception? So this is a four-stage approach, which we typically look into at Fetch. So it comes down to understand the profile of the user, understand who your user is, how they navigate into your site, the sort of technology that they're using, testing it, so the tools that we can use, optimizing based on what we found, and then monitoring that and ultimately repeating the process. So when it comes to the profile, what we need to do is make sure the user is at the center of all performance optimization efforts. So by doing that, we need to build out a typical mobile user profile, essentially. And there are ways we can do this. Obviously, we have Google Analytics. We can look in device model, browser, operating system, geolocation, just to get an idea of that. And also, in terms of connectivity, I know you can get it in the Chrome UX report, but to pull it into GA, you can also use the NetInfo API, which essentially runs in the browser and can pull performance information in terms of what your user is using in terms of connectivity site, pull it into as an event, and this is a really useful post in terms of how you can implement that. And then once we have that, we can start establishing the key testing profiles and their associated conditions, how they're visiting our site. So one thing to bear in mind throughout, there's no one blanket approach when it comes to profiles. There's going to be variables that come into play. So for example, if our two biggest users, one may be on iPhone 7, a 4G connection using Chrome to browse the site, and then the other one, Galaxy S5 on 3G using Internet Explorer. I don't know anyone uses Internet Explorer, but if you were to put that side by side, this is the differing experience that we see on the same site. So essentially, this loads in 6.5 seconds. I think this goes up to around about 20 seconds. So it is a differing experience, and it's important to be aware of that, especially when you're testing. So when it comes to testing, you need to start testing user experience and not technology. So get in the mindset of the user, as I keep saying, focus on the metrics that matter. So I briefly touched on some of them earlier. So the first contentful paint, is it happening? Is the user seeing some progress with the page? That's what's really important. Moving on to first meaningful paint, is it useful? Are they going to be sticking around for that? And then time to interactive, can they actually use the page? There are loads of testing tools that we can use. Lighthouse, PageSpeed Insights, some more enterprise like Speed Curve that you can use to pull in those metrics to really build out the case in terms of what the issues currently are on your site. So this is how we do this when you're out of time, and this is a GIF that I had to put in somehow. Ain't nobody got time for that. So you can test at scale. So what I typically do in terms of a process, pulling crawl data from things like Screaming Frog, use a tool like URL Profiler to really do things at scale or to make that process a little bit. With URL Profiler, you can pull in analytics data. You can also pull in performance data, especially with PageSpeed Insights. And then the output that you get, so this is an example output, an ugly Excel spreadsheet, but essentially what you can do based on URL level, you can understand how each URL is performing and then categorize them by template and see how, based on template, how they're all performing. And against that, you've got revenue, you've got search impressions, and all those sort of insights to really prioritize what you should be driving, what you should be optimizing as a priority. With these tools, it's important to bear in mind that they're different data sets. So you've got lab data and you've got field data. So when it comes to lab data, this is more controlled performance. So you're setting the variables yourself. And it's not really representative of what the user's seeing. And then field data, which is more true world performance experiences, so what the users are going to be seeing their side of things. So lab data, so you've got Lighthouse, you've got web page test, and then field data, you've got Chrome UX report. And in the middle, because it's a combination of Lighthouse and Chrome UX, you've got PageSpeed Insights. But again, one thing to bear in mind is that these tools don't run on user devices, so they don't reflect actual performance, which is where performance-aware browser APIs come into play. So for each of these key metrics that I mentioned earlier, so first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, time to interactive, you have all of these APIs that you can lean on to run it within the browser to pull that data through to Google Analytics to ultimately inform your optimization decisions. So Performance Observer, essentially, it collects the performance data at runtime, and you can pull in with this first contentful paint and first paint. User timing API. This is very bespoke in terms of how you implement it. It's bespoke to your site, so it depends on how your site is built, what's important for the business. Focus on your hero element to really count how long it takes for your hero element to appear. So for Airbnb, they would work out how long it takes for their search function to appear. And time to interactive. So this is essentially once there's a 5-second period where there's been less than 2 network connections of the most recent long task, that's when it's classed as interactable. This is a post that's really good in terms of how you implement it and how you start tracking it in Google Analytics. And also, they go into a lot of depth about this at Google I/O 17, so highly recommend watching this video too. With all of this, you can pull it into the user timings report, which can be found here. Really useful stuff in terms of overlaying actual performance as opposed to sort of more vanity metrics. So once we're at that point, we can start optimizing. Again, just a reminder, we want to deliver the perception of speed. One of the key areas is streamline the critical rendering path. Bastian talks about this in great detail, and I'd highly recommend seeing his talk. He do a lot more justice than I can right now. But essentially, it's prioritizing your main content on your site, so that loads first before anything below the fold, which sort of ties into lazy loading, which is anything below the fold. So there's instances, typically on like e-commerce sites, where you have high-res images below the fold that are actually taking up a lot of the load time when users aren't going to see it. So it's prioritizing that content until you actually need it. Another resource that I'd recommend looking into is the Google lazy loading images and video blog post. So that's, yeah, again, another useful one. Images. I know images, it's always been a focus when it comes to websites, especially mobile. So the average mobile website is around about 50% images, which is huge. So it's a big opportunity and something we should be really looking into in terms of tapping into how we optimize those and how we reduce the size of our sites. So we have ways in which we can approach that. Choosing the right image format. So we've had instances where, you know, JPEGs and PNGs, but also beyond that, sort of next generation image formats like WebPs and JPEG 2000s. So making sure that we're streamlining how heavy our images are, and where necessary, you know, really choosing the one that we need to deliver. We need to deliver a high-res image, then how do we approach that? Compress images. So as I mentioned earlier, so what I featured on the first slide is actually it's 2 halves of an image. You can barely tell on this screen. You can actually hardly tell on this screen. But essentially, there's 2 types of compression types you can use. So lossy is where the compression eliminates data, and then lossless is where the compression doesn't eliminate data, and also it does reduce and compress the file, and you can uncompress it for future reference. Yeah, another one that in terms of automating this, you can use tools like Kraken.io if you've got WordPress or Magento, TinyPNG, some really useful tools to get onto that. And then beyond that, responsive images. So in terms of responsive images, this is really tailoring performance to what the device that your user is using. So here we have example code that you'd use for responsive images. So source that is essentially saying to the browser, these are a set of images for this one image that you're looking for. And then you have the conditions based on the screen resolution. If the screen is this size, then send this image. And as I said, it's a way of tailoring the performance, so you're not sending this huge high-res image to a mobile device that doesn't actually need it. Again, that isn't the length of it. There are a lot of other ways that you can optimize images, and there's also ways in which you can automate it. Again, on Google, there are a lot of resources in there. I'd highly recommend actually going into the performance folder of Google. They really give you a lot of information in terms of how you drive efficiencies when it comes to performance, and especially in a mobile-centric perspective. This slide doesn't have the animation I wanted. This meant to pop up afterwards. But essentially code splitting. So this is within Google DevTools, their coverage report, where if you run a page, you can identify how much of each resource is being used that you have to load. So as you can see here, the top one, a JavaScript file, actually almost 70% of it isn't being used, but we're having to load all of it. So that's really going to be impacting how quickly the page loads. And then resource hints. So resource hints is really useful in terms of helping browsers prioritize your content, giving them that additional information in terms of how they should be loading your page and how they should be building it. So preload is really useful in highlighting the resources you need to build the page. So prioritizing CSS, certain HTML files, JavaScript, fonts, for example. Pre-connect is when you're preempting the next step in terms of where users are going. No, prefetch is the next step. Pre-connect is telling if you need to link to external origin or another origin from the page you're currently on. But one thing throughout this to bear in mind is Chrome DevTools will be your best friend. There's so much you can use in there. I could probably do an entire talk on how you can use Chrome DevTools for this optimization. And I'd highly recommend having a play around. And again, as I said, within Google, there is a resource where they essentially run through, and there's a lot of videos, a lot of supporting documents that help you through that. And even more so, at Brighton SEO, Polly went through a lot of, especially with Lighthouse, the optimization she'd go through there. I covered off some of them just now, but she also goes to like HTTP2, those sort of things. And I believe she's on the 4th stage today, at about 3. So make sure you do check her out, because I know she will also be covering in terms of optimization when it comes to performance. In terms of monitoring, we have many solutions we can use. So the likes of Pingdom, I know DeepCrawl have a lot of capabilities there, and then SpeedCurve, more of an enterprise. Again, we have, just like the tools that we do for testing, we have those in terms of monitoring. And if you're looking for a free version, if you're not got the budget to splash out on some of these tools, then you have things like user time report. Overlay this with custom alerts. You can essentially say, based on landing page, if user timing is greater than X, send me an email, because then you know something is awry. But yeah, that's really useful in terms of a free solution in monitoring. And then above that, you've got Search Console Speed Report, which is in beta and hopefully roll out relatively soon. But this provides an aggregated view over a site's field metrics. As I said, field being powered by Chrome UX, as we can see up there, so it's more representative of user performance. This is, again, another insight of Google's pushing the initiative of performance and the importance of it. And if you need to build a case, or if you're seeing improvements across the board, if you need to continue to build a case to a client, or if you're internal and you're really driving that efficiency, Google has a nice impact calculator, a bit of a novelty, but essentially based on an algorithm that they've built, you can specify average monthly visits, the conversion rate you have, and then average order value. And based on your existing performance, if you were to reduce it by, say, 1 second, that's about the amount of revenue that you can use. Obviously, you can switch out the $ for £sign if you're using it in the UK, but this is nice to really build those numbers, because I know a lot of clients really want to see those numbers in terms of what does this actually drive. Yeah. So yeah, just to sort of summarize on that side of things, so we have profiling the user, understanding who our user is, testing the site and uncovering the issues that we need to be optimizing for, which then goes into the optimization, monitoring to make sure the impact that it has been noted, and then we repeat the process. What I'd highly recommend, as with a lot of things when it comes to SEO, don't do everything all at once. You'll be creating too many variables. You won't know what is really having the impact, what's really driving that efficiency. So make sure that you're only introducing one change per time, every time you go around that loop. And then when it comes to the future, so users ultimately will expect things to be quicker, and they'd want more seamless experiences. I know myself, over the last few years, I've started to become a lot more impatient when it comes to mobile, purely because of the standard that's being created by a lot of the sites around us. That being said, not all doom and gloom, we are getting better at this. So Google did a recent study where they observed improvements across the whole web based on a previous study, and they found that on a per-country basis, more than 95% of countries had improved speed, which, I mean, is a good job. There's a way to go still. There's a lot we still need to do. But in favor of us, there's also enhancements that are continually being developed. One that I'd obviously need to speak about if I'm talking about mobile is 5G. So in terms of 5G, it's slowly being adopted now. You've probably seen a lot of the advertisements around, but adoption rate is expected to be around 1 in 7 mobile connections by 2025. So it's quite a slow uptake in comparison to the trajectory that we saw with 4G, but it's still something of consideration purely because that 5G will bring higher speeds, low latency, so allow for that more seamless experience. In terms of additional recommendations, Rachel at DeepCrawl went into quite a lot of depth for the most recent Brighton SEO, how you can use the NetInfo API, as I mentioned earlier, about tracking 3G connections to really personalize experiences. So if they're on a 3G connection, deliver them a blurred image as opposed to the high-res image, that sort of thing. So I recommend checking that. I've linked to it here in terms of the wider optimizations that you can really drive there. So in terms of key takeaways, I have rattled through this. So just to wrap this up, the key takeaways from this: design a fast web experience across all devices. So make sure that you're not focusing just on desktop. Mobile is just as important, as we've seen with device usage. Deliver a perception of speed. So if you can't build a site that is actually fast, focus on the things that matter that will ultimately reduce that bounce rate for the user, and make it seem like your site is fast. That's going to ultimately stop them from leaving your site. Measure metrics that matter to the user. So as I said, don't worry about these 100 out of 100s or grade A's and those sort of things. Actually focus on sort of the first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, and time to interactive, because that is ultimately what's going to be impacting your users the most, and which is what's of most important for us. Continue to refine the performance experience. So continually learn, continue to develop, never stop with this. This is an ongoing process. And as competitors move the needle, you're going to have to move the needle as well. Highly recommend, don't wait for Google to tell you, actually, this is the standard. Sort of drive that standard yourself. And sort of contradictory to what Sam said, I actually recommend taking developers for a drink, purely because you're going to need them on your side. This isn't something that you'll be able to do as a one-man band. Take them for a drink, have a conversations around what's required, and get them on your side, because there's going to be a lot of resource their side that's required to really drive these efficiencies in sort of optimizations of performance. Finally, in terms of resources, there are a lot of references throughout this presentation, all of which are put as a source, but also ones that I'd like to highlight. You've got a lot of presentations here, like the likes of Polly, as I mentioned earlier, Jono. Equally, DeepCrawl do a fantastic guide on site speed performance across the board if you're looking for a wider context of why this all matters and the additional foundation information. And also Code Labs. There's a free course on Code Labs about how to optimize critical rendering path. So if that's all new to you, I'd highly recommend checking that out. And that is all from me. If you do have any questions, do tweet me at Luke Monaghan, and I'll also be around today and at drinks later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you.